Welcome back to the Casual Ethnographer. My name is Elizabeth, also known as the Internet Culture Lady. In a recent video I did about Venezuela, I got a request for more information about the Monroe Doctrine. So that is what this video will be about. It'll be another long form video. Again, not my usual content, but since it was requested, here it is. The Venezuela video has a part 2 that I haven't released yet. I was just waiting to see if the first one got a little more interest before I released it. So if you want to see it, let me know in the comments below. So I'm going to do this in a couple different parts. The first part, I'm just going to give you the information presented in the archives, which I found at archives.gov/milestone documents/Monroe Doctrine. And I will read to you what is on that website to save you guys a visit, but you're still welcome to go take a look. And then we'll get into kind of an understanding of it. And please ignore my cat. He is having too much fun at the back door. Okay, so this says the Monroe Doctrine was articulated in President James Monroe's 7th annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823. The European powers, according to Monroe, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States' sphere of interest. President James Monroe's 1823 annual message to Congress contained the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Again, I'm just reading off of what the website said. Understandably, the United States has always taken a particular interest in its closest neighbors, the nations of the Western Hemisphere. Equally understandably, expressions of this concern have not always been favorably regarded by other American nations. The Monroe Doctrine is the best known U.S. policy toward the Western Hemisphere. Buried in a routine annual message delivered to Congress by President James Monroe in December 1823, the doctrine warns European nations that the United States would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. The doctrine was conceived to meet major concerns of the moment, but it soon became a watchword of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was invoked in 1865 when the U.S. government exerted diplomatic and military pressure in support of the Mexican president Benito Juarez. This support enabled Juarez to lead a successful revolt against the Emperor Maximilian, who had been placed on the throne by the French government. Almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors of a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect debts. President Theodore Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in his so-called Roosevelt Corollary, or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. While the Monroe Doctrine's message was designed to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt would strengthen its meaning to justify sending the United States into other countries of the Western Hemisphere. As a result, U.S. Marines were sent into Santo Domingo in He jumped and I jumped. As a result, U.S. Marines were sent into Santo Domingo in 1904, Nicaragua in 1911, and Haiti in 1915, ostensibly to keep the Europeans out. Other Latin American nations viewed these interventions with misgiving, and relations between the great colossus of the North and its southern neighbors remained strained for many years. In 1962, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked symbolically when the Soviet Union began to build missile launching sites in Cuba. With the support of the Organization of American States, President John F. Kennedy threw a naval and air quarantine around the island. After several tense days, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles and dismantle the sites. Subsequently, the United States dismantled several of its obsolete air and missile bases in Turkey. So, I do have a transcript. Again, that's just what the archives note before giving the transcript of the doctrine itself. So I will read that next, and then we can get into reviewing it. So, again, this was December 2nd, 1823. So, this is the quote. At the proposal of the Russian imperial government made through the minister of the emperor residing here, a full power and instructions have been transmitted to the minister of the United States at St. Petersburg to arrange by amicable negotiation the respective rights and interests of the two nations on the northwest coast of this continent. A similar proposal has been made by His Imperial Majesty to the government of Great Britain, which has likewise been acceded to. The government of the United States has been desirous of this friendly proceeding, of manifesting the great value which they have invariably attached to the friendship of the Emperor, and their solicitude to cultivate the best understanding with his government. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate the occasion, has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered any subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It was stated at the commencement of the last session that a great effort was then making in Spain and Portugal to improve the condition of the people of those countries, and that it appeared to be conducted with extraordinary moderation. It need scarcely be remarked that the results have been so far very different from what was then anticipated. Of events in that quarter of the globe, with which we have so much intercourse and from which we derive our origin, we have always been anxious and interested spectators. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on that side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers, in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers. The political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments, and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. This whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. In the war between those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition, and to this we have adhered and shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur in which judgment of the competent authorities of this government shall make a corresponding change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. The late events in Spain and Portugal shew that Europe is still unsettled. Of this important fact, no stronger proof can be adduced than the Allied powers should have thought it proper, or any principle satisfactory to themselves, to have interposed by force in the internal concerns of Spain. To what extent such interposition may be carried on the same principle is the question in which all independent powers whose governments differ from theirs are interested, even those most remote, and surely none of them more so than the United States. Our policy in regards to Europe, which was adopted at the early stage of the wars, which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none, but in regard to those continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness, nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments in their instance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in hope that other powers will pursue the same course. Okay, so that is the actual doctrine, and let's get into what that means. So, again, this happened in 1823. The President, James Monroe, presented it in his annual message to Congress, December 2nd, 1823, largely drafted with input from his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. Many nations in Latin America had recently gained independence from European colonial powers. The United States was concerned that European empires might attempt to recolonize newly independent states. The doctrine set out several key ideas, so I'm going to name three. First one, non-colonization. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future European colonization. Number two, the sphere of influence. Any attempt by European powers to interfere in the internal affairs of nations in the Americas would be seen as a hostile act towards the United States. Number three, reciprocal non-interference. The U.S. would not interfere in the internal affairs of European nations or their existing colonies. So, kind of a simple way to summarize all this was Europe stays out of the Americas, the U.S. doesn't involve itself in European conflicts. At the time, the U.S. didn't have the military capacity to enforce this, and European powers largely ignored it initially. Okay, so why did he announce it? I've got three factors that contributed to this announcement. One, the newly independent Latin American nations were vulnerable to European recolonization or interference. Number two, the U.S. itself did not want European entanglements in its politics and wars. Number three, it built on earlier ideas in U.S. diplomacy about avoiding European entanglement. So the doctrine was both pragmatic and strategic, a mix of idealistic non-colonial rhetoric and an assertion of regional influence. Okay, so how did it evolve over time? The Roosevelt Corollary of 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt added a corollary saying the U.S. might intervene in Latin American countries to prevent European intervention, effectively justifying American interventionalism. In the 20th century, how was it used? So throughout the 1900s, the doctrine and its extensions was used as justification for U.S. involvement in Central and South America, such as Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, in different eras. So symbolic invocations. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, U.S. leaders referenced principles from the Monroe Doctrine in framing their stance against Soviet missiles in Cuba. So, let's think about a few things. It was not written into law. It was a policy statement, part of a presidential message to Congress, not a binding treaty or a statute. It was initially a reaction to post-colonial geopolitics. European empires had ruled much of the Americas. Many new republics had just emerged after independence movements. So the U.S. was asserting that future European intervention was not acceptable. Its meaning has shifted over time. Under later presidents, especially with the Roosevelt Corollary, the doctrine came to be used to justify American intervention in the region, sometimes controversially. I always have a hard time with that word, sorry. And then it's historically important, not a simple moral statement. So it reflects U.S. strategic interests as well as diplomatic ideals, and historians debate both its intentions and its consequences. So why does it matter, kind of in the broad range of things? So it helped shape how the U.S. saw its role in the Americas. Later interpretations influenced U.S. foreign policy in Latin America in the 20th century, and now apparently in the 21st century. It became a reference point in discussions of power, influence, and sovereignty over time. So those are my notes regarding the Monroe Doctrine. If you happen to be someone who has studied this in greater depth, please drop some comments below. If you're a poli-sci major or lecturer, I'd be curious to know what you have to say as well. But that is all I have for you today. So I thank you for joining me, and I appreciate your presence. I'll see you next time.